developing news from Ukraine. Warning shots were fired at a group of European observers trying to enter Crimea for a second time. 43 unarmed monitors from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe were turned away by pro-Russian forces. The group said the gunmen were agitated and that the situation is getting tenser. In another apparent escalation, Russia is reportedly considering stopping the US from inspecting its nuclear weapons. That's in response to Western sanctions over Ukraine. It's being reported by Russian news agencies. So far, there's been no official reaction. Meanwhile, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, said he's committed to dialogue with the West, but he again questioned the legitimacy of Ukraine's acting government.
They are trying to represent us as a conflicting side, which we are not. This conflict is of an inner Ukrainian nature, inspired from outside and not from our side. The so-called temporary government is not independent. Unfortunately, it depends on radical nationalists who took power in an armed coup.
Meanwhile, in Kiev, Ukraine's acting foreign minister is insisting he won't give up Crimea and he wants an international contact group to negotiate with Russia.
We should discuss various forms of cooperation. However, it's a shaky proposal. Many questions remain as to how it could work, but it's better than nothing and no dialogue at all. Ukraine is ready to consider various options and choices. How to cooperate with the contact group, our main priority is a diplomatic solution.
Lincoln Mitchell is a consultant on business and politics in the former Soviet Union and a senior advisor to Columbia University's Human Rights Institute. He joins me now live from New York. Do you think there are questions to be answered about the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government, as Mr. Lavrov says?
Well, in some sense, the question that needs to be answered is that the dramatic discrepancy with which that government is viewed in the West and in Russia. The West sees it as unequivocally a legitimate government, and Russia sees it as a coup. And it may be that the truth lies somewhere in between, which is something nobody in the West wants to mention or discuss, but to be open to thinking about that and at least thinking about Russia's perspective on this, which is not to say that Russia is not in the wrong here. In my view, Russia clearly is in the wrong. Regardless of their views on that government, what they've done in Crimea doesn't follow from that as the right thing to do.
When you say Russia is in the wrong, you say Russia is in the wrong because it sent these troops inside the Crimean, yes, across the border?
Right. With regards specifically to the invasion of Crimea, we have to kind of separate these two issues out a little bit. We can't, the temptation is to say that if you question the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government as it's now constituted, you're kind of therefore legitimizing the invasion of Crimea. And in my view, we need to disconnect that. Because the question of the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government is something that should be discussed. There is no legitimacy of the Russian invasion of Crimea. That's something we should all recognize.
So the suggestion of an international contact group, that would help the diplomacy, because there's no way Moscow is going to negotiate with Kiev, is it?
That's right. And the government in Kiev is smart enough to understand that. I think this is a good proposal. So we'll see what happens. But it remains true that Western options, particularly American options, are relatively limited, and that's not lost on Moscow.
What about Crimea? Let's go back to Crimea now. A majority are Russian speakers. Do they want to be part of Russia, or do they want perhaps greater autonomy?
Well, the question is also, when you describe there also are people in Crimea that are not Russian speakers, that don't want to be part of Russia. There also are people in Crimea who were expelled from Crimea in the World War II era. And they're now in Central Asia or Eastern Russia, and they might want to come back and certainly wouldn't want to be part of Russia. So it's a very complicated demographic picture. But even if we say that the Russian speakers do want to be part of Russia, to get from there to Russian troops invading I don't really get the logic of that. There's certainly a model where there's more autonomy, but they had a fair amount of autonomy. And I was in Crimea, I don't know, about a year and a half ago, and it is, more autonomous, I would say, than a state in the United States is, for example. Yeah. And there is the Russian base there, and there's no real oppression of Russian speakers. This notion that Russian speakers are losing their rights or are in physical danger, there's no real evidence of that.
Is this a question of the Russian bear being prodded by Brussels, the European Union, over money and reacting perhaps overmuch because of what they see as this perceived threat to Ukraine moving towards the West?
Well, it's a little bit of that. I mean, more generally, this is a case of Russia and its leadership acting to protect Russia's interests, and Russia's interests being in conflict with those of the West and some of our newer allies, including the current government in Kiev, including the government of the state of Georgia, including Moldova. But this is about, I think, to make this about Russia being angry or hurt. And well, that's Georgia, yeah. But to say this as Russia being angry or hurt, rather than Russia acting on its interest. That's the wrong approach. We have to understand Russia's interest here, although we may not agree with them, and I don't agree with what they've done. That's what's informing this, not some narrative that Putin is crazy or something, which gets us off in a very useless and kind of destructive direction.
Indeed it does. All right, well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Lots more to